In 1941, in the deep swamps of Louisiana, there was a midwife named Constance Delacroix who delivered babies for families that couldn't afford hospital care. She was respected. She was trusted. Mothers called her when their time came because she was the only help they had. But something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with Constance. Something that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Something that got worse every single year she practiced. At first, people noticed small things, babies that died under her care when they should have lived, mothers who never fully recovered from births she attended, strange marks on newborns, bruises that didn't make sense. But in 1941, rural Louisiana, you didn't question a midwife. You didn't have the luxury of doubt. If Constance was your only option, then Constance was what you got. And if something went wrong, well, sometimes babies died. Sometimes mothers didn't make it. That was just how life was back then. But the deaths kept happening. And they kept getting stranger. Babies born with injuries that seemed deliberate. Mothers found in states of complete psychological breakdown after Constance attended them. And then there were the disappearances. Pregnant women who went into labor, called Constance, and were never seen again. Not their bodies, not any trace of them. Just gone. Vanished into the Louisiana swamps like they'd never existed at all. I grew up hearing stories about Constance Delacroix from my grandmother. Stories that were whispered late at night, stories that people didn't want to tell in daylight, stories about a woman who'd gone insane, who'd become possessed by something dark, something that made her do unspeakable things to the women and babies she was supposed to help. For years, I thought those were just folklore, rural superstition mixed with historical trauma. But then I started researching. Then I found the records. Then I found the truth. What I discovered was that my grandmother hadn't been exaggerating. If anything, the reality was worse than the whispers. Constance Delacroix didn't just let babies die. She didn't just traumatize mothers. She actively murdered them. She buried pregnant women alive in the swamps. She smothered newborns. She performed procedures on mothers that were designed to cause maximum psychological damage. And she did it all while maintaining her reputation as a trusted healer in her community. She did it for over a decade. She did it while authorities looked the other way. She did it while the people around her pretended they didn't know what was happening. This is the story of how a midwife became a serial killer, how an entire community enabled her crimes through silence, and how the truth finally emerged from the Louisiana swamps. Before we dive into the absolutely horrifying details of what Constance Delacroix did in those Louisiana swamps, I need to ask you something. What state are you watching this from right now? Are you from Louisiana? Maybe you're watching from Texas or Florida or somewhere completely different that I never would have guessed. I really want to know. Drop your state in the comments below because I genuinely want to understand who's watching this story and where you're coming from. And while you're down there in the comments, hit that like button if this story about a possessed midwife and buried secrets is absolutely blowing your mind. Show YouTube that you want more content like this. Stories about forgotten dark history. Stories about serial killers nobody talks about. Stories that expose the truth about what happened in small towns. And if you haven't subscribed to Christmas Terror yet, what are you waiting for? We've got incredible stories coming all the time. Stories about horror, darkness, and the macabre. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and never miss a video. Now let's get into this, because what happened in Louisiana was truly deranged. Constance Delacroix was born in 1903 in rural Louisiana, in a family that had been dealing with death and madness for generations. Her mother died giving birth to her. Her father was a man who drank himself to death by the time Constance was 15. She had a younger brother who drowned in the swamps under circumstances that nobody ever fully explained. Constance grew up surrounded by death, surrounded by loss, surrounded by a landscape that seemed to actively want to kill you if you weren't careful. Or maybe if you were. She apprenticed as a midwife when she was 17 years old, learning from an older woman named Marie Thibodeau, who'd been delivering babies in the bayou for 40 years. Marie taught her the practical stuff, how to recognize complications, how to help a mother through a difficult labor, how to keep a newborn alive. But Marie also taught her something else. She taught Constance about the old ways, the folk magic, the remedies that came from herbs and roots and things that people didn't talk about in polite company. The rituals that were supposed to protect mother and child, but that had darker applications if you knew how to use them. By the time Marie died in 1932, Constance had taken over her practice. She was a talented midwife in many ways. She had good hands. She understood the physiology of birth. She could deliver babies in situations where other midwives would have given up. And she was available. In the depths of the Depression, when rural Louisiana was suffering worse than almost anywhere else in the country, Constance would come to a house in the middle of the night for almost nothing. Sometimes just for food. Sometimes just out of what people thought was compassion. She became indispensable to the communities in the bayou. But something about Constance was off. People who worked with her noticed it. She would sometimes stare at a pregnant woman with an expression that was hard to describe, something between pity and hunger. She would make comments that seemed random, but that took on darker meaning later. She would perform procedures that weren't medically necessary, but that she insisted on doing anyway. She would hum strange songs during deliveries, songs that nobody recognized, songs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her that wasn't quite human. And then there were the stillbirths, an unusually high number of them, an unusually high number of maternal deaths, an unusually high number of babies born with injuries that seemed like they'd been inflicted rather than accidental. Midwives have a certain loss rate. It's tragic, but it's expected. But Constance's numbers were alarming. The doctors in the nearest town would occasionally talk about her numbers, would express concern. But what could they do? She wasn't technically breaking any laws. There was no oversight of midwives in 1941 Louisiana. There was no regulation. There was no accountability. Constance existed in a space where she could do almost anything and face almost no consequences. And she knew it. I think she always knew it. I think that's why she chose to be a midwife in the first place. By the late 1930s, Constance had started to completely lose her grip on reality. Or maybe she was never gripping it to begin with. Maybe what was happening was that she was finally giving herself permission to do the things she'd been thinking about for years. The stillbirths continued, but they weren't the only thing happening anymore. There were the disappearances. Pregnant women who went to Constance for help and were never seen again, not reported missing at first. In rural Louisiana during the Depression, people disappeared all the time for all sorts of reasons. But eventually, families started to notice. Fathers came looking for their wives, children asked where their mothers went. And the answer was always the same: she went to see the midwife and she never came home. By 1940, at least 7 women had disappeared after seeking Constance's help with pregnancies. 7 known disappearances. There were probably more that nobody ever reported. 7 women who had families who loved them, who had children waiting at home, who just vanished into the bayou. The police were eventually called, though calling the police in rural Louisiana in 1941 was like calling ghosts. They would show up hours later if they showed up at all, and they weren't particularly motivated to investigate the disappearance of poor women from poor families. When they did investigate, Constance had answers. She said the women came to her but decided to go somewhere else. She said they went into the swamps and got lost. She said they ran away because their families were abusive. She had explanations for everything, and most importantly, she had no evidence against her. No bodies, no witnesses, no proof of anything except that women kept disappearing after they came to see her. But the whispers started, the rumors. People began to suspect. Mothers started to refuse to call her. but most couldn't afford anyone else. Most didn't have a choice. Constance had a monopoly on childbirth in that region, and she knew it. She could do almost anything, and women would still come to her because they had no other option. Then, in 1941, a woman named Sarah Boudreau went into labor with her third child. She called Constance. Her husband wasn't home, he was working in town. Her two other children were asleep. Constance came alone. What happened next is where the story gets truly dark. Sarah's labor went wrong. The baby was breached. Sarah was bleeding. She was in crisis. And instead of getting her to a hospital, instead of calling for help, Constance did something. Something that Sarah's children heard through the walls. Something that made them scream. Something that Sarah never recovered from. Sarah lived but barely. She was hospitalized for weeks. She couldn't speak about what happened. She wouldn't speak about it. But people who saw her said she looked like something inside her had been fundamentally broken. People said she had the look of someone who'd experienced something so horrifying that her mind refused to process it. That's when people started talking. That's when the rumors became accusations. That's when someone finally decided to investigate what Constance Delacroix had really been doing. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Louisiana had seen before. For the first time, someone took the disappearances seriously. For the first time, someone decided to actually look into what Constance Delacroix had been doing. A state trooper named James Whitmore came to the region and started talking to people. And once people started talking, the dam broke. Dozens of families came forward with stories. Stories about mothers who'd gone to Constance and never came back. Stories about babies who were born wrong, twisted, damaged, sometimes already dead when they came out. Stories about rituals that Constance performed that didn't seem like medicine. Stories about chanting and strange symbols drawn on mothers' bodies and things that didn't have any explanation in the world of modern medicine. Whitmore started to connect the dots. He looked at Constance's property, a ramshackle house on the edge of the swamps that she'd inherited from Marie Thibodeau. The house had outbuildings. It had strange markings on the walls inside. It had a room in the basement that seemed designed for purposes that had nothing to do with delivering babies. And outside, in the swamps surrounding the property, there were disturbed areas of earth. Mounds that looked like graves. They started digging, and what they found was going to change everything. They found 5 bodies in those swamps, all women, all showing signs of trauma that suggested they'd been deliberately harmed. One of them was still clutching the remains of a newborn. Another had evidence of being buried alive. Scratch marks on the inside of what appeared to be a wooden box that they found in the deeper swamps. The medical examiner who came to examine the remains said things that he would never be able to unsay. He said things that haunted him for the rest of his life. Constance was arrested. She was brought in for questioning. And when confronted with the evidence, when confronted with the bodies, when confronted with the impossibility of denying what she'd done, she didn't deny it. She confessed to everything. She confessed to killing the women. She confessed to smothering newborns. She confessed to performing dark rituals on mothers. She confessed to burying women alive in the swamps. And when asked why, her answer was chilling. She said that she was possessed. She said that something dark had entered her years ago and that it had been controlling her actions. She said that the women deserved to die because they were bringing sin into the world by having children out of wedlock, or by betraying their husbands, or by various other moral failings that Constance's twisted mind had decided they were guilty of. She said that she was an instrument of divine punishment. She said that God had chosen her to cleanse the community of immoral women. She said that everything she'd done was righteous and just. And even as she said all this, even as she confessed to murder after murder, there was something in her eyes that suggested she genuinely believed every word of it. She wasn't lying. She wasn't trying to evade responsibility. She was telling what she believed to be the absolute truth about her actions and her motivations. The trial of Constance Delacroix was one of the most disturbing legal proceedings in Louisiana history. The state built a case based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Constance's own confessions. The prosecution laid out exactly what she'd done, the specific women she'd killed, the methods she'd used, the clear premeditation involved in some of the murders. They brought mothers who survived her care to testify about what she'd done to them. They brought families of the missing women to describe their loss. They brought investigators who detailed the discovery of the bodies and the conditions in which they were found. The defense didn't try to deny what happened. Instead, they argued insanity. They brought psychiatrists who examined Constance and testified that she was suffering from severe mental illness, that she had likely been psychotic for years, that she genuinely believed she was acting on divine instruction. The defense argued that Constance should be found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a psychiatric facility rather than executed. But the prosecution countered that Constance's actions showed clear planning and intelligence. She had covered her tracks. She had maintained her reputation in the community despite ongoing suspicions. She had explained away disappearances. She had hidden bodies so that they wouldn't be discovered. These weren't the actions of someone completely divorced from reality. These were the actions of someone who understood the consequences of her actions and deliberately worked to avoid those consequences. The prosecution argued that Constance knew exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was guilty on 7 counts of murder. 7 counts, though the actual number of victims was likely higher, possibly as high as 15 or 20 if you counted the stillbirths and the newborns who died under her care. But 7 were the ones they could prove beyond reasonable doubt. 7 were the murders they had evidence for. 7 women whose names and faces became permanently associated with Constance Delacroix's crimes. Constance was sentenced to death. The execution was set for 1942. But before it happened, before the state could carry out the sentence, Constance died in her cell. The official cause was a heart attack, but the guards who found her said that she seemed almost peaceful. They said that she looked like she'd been waiting for death, like she'd been expecting it, like she'd accepted it. Some people whispered that she'd killed herself. Some people said that the darkness that had possessed her finally released her when she was no longer useful. Some people just said that God had taken her before the state had to. What remained was the aftermath. The community had to reckon with what had been happening in their midst. Families had to bury their dead. Survivors had to live with the trauma. And the story became a legend. A story whispered late at night about the possessed midwife who'd buried women alive in the Louisiana swamps. The story of Constance Delacroix didn't end with her death. If anything, it only got darker. Her house became a place of legend. Children dared each other to go near it. People said that at night you could hear screaming coming from the swamps around it. They said you could see lights moving through the bayou. They said that Constance's spirit was still there, still looking for women, still trying to complete her mission of divine cleansing. Whether you believed in ghosts or not, the psychological impact was real. The house became a place where locals feared to go. Years later, historians and researchers tried to understand what had happened. They examined Constance's background, looking for explanations. They looked at the psychology of serial killing. They tried to determine whether she had actually been mentally ill or whether she was simply evil. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple explanation. Constance had suffered trauma. She had grown up around death and madness. She had been isolated in a community where there was no oversight, no accountability, no one to stop her from doing whatever she wanted. She had access to vulnerable women who had no other options. She had a belief system, rooted in folk superstition and Catholic guilt, that allowed her to justify her actions as righteous. But none of that explains the specifics. None of that explains why she chose to bury some women alive. None of that explains the rituals, the supernatural claims, the genuine belief that she was possessed by something dark. Some people who've studied the case believe that Constance may have had a dissociative disorder, that she genuinely didn't remember some of what she did, that she compartmentalized her crimes into a separate identity that she believed was not her, but something else entirely. Some people believe she was simply a sadist who found a way to practice her sadism without consequence. Some people believe she was actually possessed, that there was something supernatural involved. The case led to reforms in Louisiana. It led to regulation of midwives. It led to better oversight of childbirth. It led to more accountability for practitioners. It led to communities taking disappearances seriously instead of accepting them as inevitable. In that sense, the tragedy of Constance's victims led to protections for future mothers and babies. But the deeper lesson is about silence. The lesson is about what happens when a community looks the other way. The lesson is about the price of not asking questions, of not challenging authority, of not protecting the vulnerable. Women were disappearing. Babies were dying. Something clearly wrong was happening. And for years, the community chose not to acknowledge it. They chose not to investigate. They chose to accept Constance's explanations. They chose silence over action. And that silence cost lives. Constance Delacroix died in 1942, but her victims' families carry her legacy forever. The swamps of Louisiana still hold her secrets. And somewhere in the darkness, in the fog that rises off the bayou at night, people still whisper her name as a warning, a reminder of what happens when evil goes unchecked. This story happened in 1941, but the questions it raises are timeless. How does evil hide in plain sight? How does a community allow something horrific to continue for years? How do we protect the vulnerable from those who prey on them? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're questions we have to keep asking. If you watched this and felt something, horror, sadness, anger, channel that into action. If you suspect that someone is being abused or exploited, speak up. If you know of a vulnerable person being taken advantage of, say something. Don't be complicit through silence. Don't let evil hide while you look away. Subscribe to Christmas Terror. We tell the stories that haunt history, the dark tales hidden behind closed doors, the crimes that communities tried to forget, the evil that wore the mask of normalcy. These stories matter. These victims matter. Their voices deserve to be heard, even if it's decades or centuries after they died. And if you're a survivor of abuse or exploitation, know that your story matters too. You're not alone. There are people who believe you. There are resources to help you. Reach out. Speak your truth. Your voice can change things. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for refusing to look away from the darkness. The work continues. Keep fighting.